April 1945. The gates of Bergen-Belsen creaked open as British tanks rolled inside. The soldiers expected to liberate a camp. Instead, they stepped into a nightmare so overwhelming that many later said it was worse than any battlefield they had seen. The smell hit first, a suffocating wall of decay and disease that made strong men drop to their knees and vomit. Bodies were stacked like firewood between collapsing barracks. Around 60,000 prisoners wandered the mud, barely recognizable as human beings, their bodies reduced to skin and bones, their eyes hollow from starvation and trauma. This was liberation, but it felt like walking through the ruins of hell. In the first week after British and Canadian forces arrived, 400 prisoners died every day. Not from Nazi bullets, not from gas chambers. They died after being saved. They died in the arms of the people who had come to rescue them. Medical teams worked non-stop, following every rule and every protocol they had been trained to follow. But each morning, wagons pulled up with new piles of corpses. The count climbed past 2,000, then 3,000, then 4,000. At this pace, commanders made a grim calculation. 30,000 more would die within 2 months, even with medical care. The conventional approach seemed obvious to every doctor. Feed the starving slowly. Give clean water. Treat the diseases. Keep patients warm. Let their bodies recover naturally. These methods had worked for thousands of wounded soldiers across Europe. But here, in Bergen-Belsen, they were failing. Prisoners who ate their first real meal in months died within hours, their bodies too weak to process the food. Others drank too much water, and their hearts simply stopped. Typhus cut through the barracks faster than anyone could treat it. Everything was being done right, and yet people kept dying in numbers that no medical textbook had ever prepared these doctors for. Senior medical officers met again and again, studying charts, debating treatments, calling in more supplies and more staff. Nothing changed. Finally, one British colonel said what everyone feared to admit: these deaths were inevitable. The survivors were too far gone. Medicine had limits, and perhaps half of them, at best, might survive. The experts had spoken. But one man refused to accept that. Lieutenant Colonel Ben Dunkelman, a 28-year-old Canadian officer who had fought across Europe from D-Day to Germany, was not a doctor. He had no medical training. He was a soldier, nothing more. But he was also Jewish, and the people dying in front of him were his people. Every face reminded him of family, of the community he had grown up with in Toronto. And as he walked through the camp, something inside him broke. He forced himself to look at everything. 50 people packed into rooms meant for 10, a single water pump serving thousands, doctors treating patients one by one while hundreds waited outside in the cold. Everywhere he turned, he saw the same truth. This was not a medical failure. It was a logistical failure. The system was killing them. That night, he sat in his tent, writing by lamplight. His hands shook with anger. The military was trying to save individuals when what they needed was a plan to save a population. Every rule the doctors followed was built for normal emergencies. But this was not normal. This was a humanitarian collapse so massive that the rulebook might as well have been useless. Then came an idea so simple and so dangerous that he nearly dismissed it. Move them. All of them. No. Get them out of this contaminated death trap and spread them across multiple locations where disease could not spread like wildfire. Move the sickest first. Do it fast. Do it before another sunrise killed another 400 people. He knew what the doctors would say. Moving the critically ill was dangerous. Transport could kill them. Standard medical training warned against it. But staying put was killing them even faster. The statistics were right there. 400 deaths a day. Doing things the right way was costing hundreds of lives every 24 hours. The next morning, Dunkelman walked into the command meeting with a folder full of calculations. He laid out his idea. Move 34,000 people in 72 hours. The room erupted. Doctors shouted. Officers laughed. One senior colonel stood up red-faced and nearly yelled at him. If you move these patients, you will kill them faster than a typhus. Sit down. Dunkelman didn't sit. He pointed to the numbers. A 12% daily death rate. If moving them reduced it even slightly, even to 9%, that was 360 lives saved per day. The medical staff pushed back. They had no transport teams, no equipment for moving fragile patients, no reliable roads. It was impossible. Irresponsible. Matt. Then Brigadier Glenn Hughes, the Deputy Director of Medical Services, spoke. He gave Dunkelman a test. 500 of the sickest patients. 24 hours. Prove it works. The next morning, Dunkelman gathered every vehicle he could find. German trucks, abandoned ambulances, even civilian buses. Nurses, orderlies, and volunteers joined him. They prepared each patient with carefully rationed food and water so their bodies would not collapse during transport. The roads were cratered and rough. The 15-kilometer trip took 3 hours. Some patients moaned or fainted. Some needed emergency care mid-journey. But they made it. The results were undeniable. Of the 500 moved, 15 died, a 3% mortality rate. Of the 500 who stay behind, 60 died, 12%, exactly as predicted. Moving the dying was safer than leaving them where they were. Brigadier Hughes reviewed the numbers again and again. Finally, he ordered a full-scale operation. 200 vehicles, 2,000 German prisoners to work under guard, 400 medical personnel reassigned, and 12 locations prepared to receive evacuees. Permission from higher command could wait. Lives could not. What followed was one of the largest improvised medical evacuations in history. Dunkelman operated on 20 hours of work a day, sleeping in trucks between convoy runs. He transformed every vehicle into a mobile treatment center. Nurses rode with every truck, monitoring patients, administering food and water on schedule. Old German barracks, schoolhouses, and factories became emergency hospitals. Each place received medicine, blankets, food, and clean water. And for the first time, medicine began working. The death rate fell from 400 to 500 a day to 50 to 80 across all facilities, an 85% drop. In the first week alone, over 3,400 lives were saved. In 8 days, 34,000 people were moved. It was the equivalent of evacuating a small city while battling disease, starvation, and war-torn roads. But success brought scrutiny. 3 days into the operation, Dunkelman was ordered to headquarters. The general demanded to know by what authority he had used enemy trucks, enemy prisoners, and moved patients against medical advice. Court-martial was on the table. Dunkelman said nothing. He had broken rules, ignored rank, and made decisions well beyond his authority. Then Brigadier Hughes walked in with mortality statistics. He read them aloud. Before evacuation, 12% daily mortality. After evacuation, 3%. Projected deaths, 30,000. Actual deaths so far under 2,000. Hughes looked up and said, "Court-martial him if you want, but do so after explaining to the world why you punished the man who saved Bergen-Belsen." The charges vanished. The operation continued. The deaths kept falling. Traditional military hospitals, perfectly equipped, fully staffed, sat nearly empty. Their slow, careful procedures were useless in a crisis where speed mattered more than precision. Meanwhile, Dunkelman's improvised network saved lives simply by creating space. Space for air to move, for disease not to spread, for bodies to rest and heal. Survivors later said the difference between the main camp and the satellite facilities was the difference between death and life. At Bergen-Belsen, people died with full stomachs because disease filled the air. In the evacuation sites, people were sick, but healing because they could finally breathe clean air. In the decades that followed, the world quietly adopted Dunkelman's methods. NATO incorporated mass evacuation protocols directly based on his approach. The Korean War used them. Vietnam used them. Medevac helicopters, mobile surgical units, rapid response evacuation teams all traced their origins to the 8 days in April 1945 when a Canadian officer with no medical background realized that sometimes the best medicine is distance, speed, and space. Dunkelman never boasted about what he had done. He went home, built a life, raised a family, served his community, and rarely spoke of Bergen-Belsen. When he did, his tone was flat, almost clinical, as if reading someone else's report. He carried the weight quietly, privately. It wasn't until survivors tracked him down decades later that the world began to understand what he had done. They remembered the trucks, the blankets, the warm food, the clean air. They remembered the officer who refused to let them die according to the rules, and instead broke every rule to let them live. Israel honored him. Canada eventually acknowledged him. But his greatest legacy lived elsewhere, In every disaster zone evacuation, every medevac helicopter, every refugee relocation protocol, every emergency response built on logistics instead of tradition. The lesson of Bergen-Belsen is simple and eternal. Sometimes the rules meant to save lives become the very thing that prevents saving them. Sometimes expertise becomes a prison. And sometimes the world only moves forward because one person dares to say, "This is not good enough. We must try something impossible." Ben Dunkelman was not the smartest man in the room. He was not the most experienced. He was simply the one who refused to accept that 400 deaths a day were inevitable. And because of that refusal, 28,000 people who were expected to die lived.